One of the more unexpected markers of insulin resistance is the skin, where the skin is, in a way, a window to peer into the metabolic health of an individual. And there are two things to look for.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Thrive State Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. V, triple board certified MD and performance and longevity expert. And on today's podcast, we really talk about metabolic health, how to eat, what to eat, and when to eat to maintain your metabolic health. We know that insulin resistance, diabetes, is really a spectrum of metabolic disease that can actually be reversed if you know how. And if you apply the tactics and strategies on today's podcast, you can have really tight blood sugar control, which will give you optimal health, longevity, and peak performance. Now, before we get onto the podcast, if you're new to this podcast, welcome in. This is a show that's really dedicated to give you all the strategies for you to live your best life, for you to be in the Thrive state. So if you're new, welcome in. Please do us a favor by subscribing to the podcast. Please engage with us in the comments and give us a 5-star review wherever podcasts are heard. That's really going to help the show grow. And if you're joining us now, let me share a free gift I'd like to give everybody. It's 3 breathing techniques to bring you more calm, more energy, and a great breathing technique for a morning routine, as well as lots of longevity resources, including How to Live to 105 ebook, lecture slides that give you all the content that I share in my corporate keynote stages, as well as a resource guide to take you to the next level. To access those resources, go to thrivestatebreath.com. Also, if you haven't already, you can pick up my book, Thrive State, the second edition at thrivestatebook.com. It's going to give you basically the blueprint you need to reach optimal health, longevity, and peak performance. Now, my guest today is a renowned scientist. He's actually an academic professor at the Brigham Young University. He's an author and also the co-founder of Health Code. His name is Dr. Benjamin Bikman. He's a renowned metabolic research scientist, and he's actually the author of the book, Why We Get Sick, the Hidden Epidemic at the Root of Most Chronic Disease and How to Fight It. He's a speaker on human metabolism and nutrition, as well as a scientist and co-founder of the company Health Code. Dr. Bickman has a Doctor of Philosophy in Bioenergetics from East Carolina University, a Master of Science in Exercise Physiology, and a Bachelor of Science in Exercise Science from Brigham Young University. Why We Get Sick, released in 2020, actually offers a thought-provoking and real solution to insulin resistance. I know this because when I reversed diabetes myself, I used the principles that are also laid out in this book. Now, this book will actually teach you how to manage if you have insulin resistance, how to reverse it, how to improve brain function, lose weight, and prevent diabetes altogether. Dr. Bickman relies on scientific research to show that prioritizing protein and healthy dietary fats and limiting the consumption of refined carbohydrates can actually optimize metabolism and resolve insulin resistance. You're not going to want to miss this episode. Please enjoy this conversation with myself and Dr. Benjamin Bikman. Dr. Ben Bikman, welcome to the Thrive State Podcast.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks, Kien.
Well, people in my audience is very familiar with how we start off the show. It's the 5 to Thrive. 5 quick questions, game show style, 1,000 points each. And you know what? No one has lost yet. And for those who win, the next time we see each other at a conference, we get a healthy meal on me. Of course, it has to be approved by you. So let me ask you, Dr. Ben, are you ready to play the 5 to Thrive?
Oh, this is great. Love it. Yes, let's go.
Question number 1. As a child, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Oh, my. Yeah. So, of course, every kid goes through a lot of things. For a time, I wanted to be a plastic surgeon. And that was because my older brother had to go through a lot of soft tissue surgeries for some palate issues. And I was so fascinated by it. So that was my very short-lived dream.
All right, plastic surgeon, now helping the world with nutrition. Question number two is, if you could have any superpower in the world, what would it be?
Oh, super speed. Easy, easy. The Flash
Oh,
all the way.
so you'd be the Flash. All right, excellent. Question number three. What was one transformative either book, concept, or idea that you had kind of growing up that just made you go, wow, I see life completely differently right now?
Oh my, what a question. Um, one of the let's go with book.
Yeah.
And this may be cliche, but I remember the first time I ever read Les Miserables by
Yes.
Victor Hugo. That
Mhm.
was probably the first book where I actually cried. I, was kind of quietly
Mm.
sobbing in the book because of the touching character of
Yeah.
Jean Valjean and his transformation and his determination to serve other people. That was a very good influence for me.
Oh, that's beautiful. One of my favorite musicals. Never read the book myself, but one of my favorite songs to sing is "Stars," which was sung by uh, uh,
Javert, yeah.
Javert. Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. One of my favorite musicals. Okay,
You would
question.
love the book. You would love the book. It's a beast. If we get an abridged version, and you would love it.
All right, we'll do question number four. Is, if you could travel back in any history, in any era of time, where would you go?
I would go to Victorian England,
Oh,
where meat consumption was at an all-time high. People were bigger, taller, stronger, and it was such a blossoming of modern technology. I'm very impressed by the advances made during the Victorian era, and that would be the time.
okay, well, perfect. Now I know when I finally buy you that meal. You've got one question left. We don't know whether you're going to get it or not. It'll certainly be a meal with meat. Last question for you is, how does Dr. Ben want to be remembered?
Oh my, yeah. I want to be remembered by my wife and children. I want to be remembered as a devoted husband and father. As much as I am tapped for my familiarity and knowledge with regards to metabolic health, and I'm very glad for that. That's a very modest part of who I am, and what I think about more than anything else is how to be the best husband and father that I can be. So if I will be remembered for anything, let it be that.
Whoa, okay. I was going to, first of all, you win and you get extra credit points for that last answer. 5,000 points, you win the Five to Thrive, which means the next conference or chance meeting we are together, we get a meal with meat on me. And I would just wanted you to go there, Dr. Ben. Has that always been something that you had because you grew up in a family where the family unit was just so tight? How did you sort of develop this? I feel like so many people these days, particularly men, are so out to achieve this mission that the home unit and really being present with loved ones is not, on top of mind for
Mm.
many people. But for you, it seemed that that answer just it was just so obvious for you.
Oh yeah, yes. My one of my mantras, not that I have them formally written down or anything. If there were, if I did, maybe the first one would be no success in life will compensate for failure in the home.
Oh
And
wow.
very much that is, I think, born from my experience. The brief version of it is I'm one of 9 children. I'm number
Wow.
6.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it was this kind of beautiful chaos as a child. But our mom got sick very early and died from cancer, and we were all quite young. And then we were raised primarily by our dad, who just raised us all very well. These are children who were all good functioning adults, married, successful, and I really credit my dad for creating a very stable environment for us, and very responsive. And so it showed me a version of fatherhood where the dad is both provider and protector in a kind of
Yes.
stereotypical way, not in a
Yes.
bad way, but
Yeah.
also a man, a father who would nurture and nourish, which is,
Mm.
often more of the kind of mom side. And my wife very much reflects that. My wife is a full-time mom. She's a homemaker with the kids all day. And I love her and revere her for that. But I'm very involved. I'm the one who gets up with the kids at night. I'm the one who makes breakfast for them, not because my wife can't, but I know she's with them all day, and whatever moments I can have of unscripted, intimate moments with my kids, I want to get them, because that's sort of how I saw it growing up. But I also know that, I mean, the moment our first kid was born, our beautiful little daughter, our oldest, not so little, she just got her driver's license. I had as close to an epiphany that I think I ever had, which is, in a way, looking at her cherubic little newborn face, I saw my immortality, my existence never ending because of my posterity. It was one of the most profound spiritual moments of my life, and I'll never forget it. And so, all the other accomplishments I have in life will be very temporary. And I know that, and that's not me being self-deprecating. That's just the nature of the world. But my continued existence, literal in my offspring, is will likely, I hope, have no end. And that to me is a pretty profound thought. So anyway, my role, what I want to be remembered for, let it be that I was a good father and a good husband.
I'm so glad you said that, because I was recently interviewed in a documentary on biohacking, and they really pressed me for what my favorite biohack was. And I just said, breathing and really being present with my family.
Oh.
And they kept pressing me. Is it red light? Is it this? Is the technology? And I reminded them, where are people live longest in the world? Where people are the happiest in the world don't actually have access to any of this technology. And we've basically created a world where technology is used to fix some of the things that we can fix ourselves just by being present with ourselves and our body. And when you mentioned that, that was just so, so beautiful. And I've had spiritual moments myself, just thinking that as I get to heal myself and work on myself and share those things with the world, if we can remember that we are actually energetically connected to everything that's created us. If we could remember that, once this meat suit is long gone, we would have said that at least the consciousness of what we get to leave behind to our children and to other people can be immortal. So,
yep. I agree.
So beautiful. You are really, probably one of the top experts in metabolic health, insulin resistance. And, I'm an MD that actually had diabetes before. And so I know just what a prevalent problem that is. Let me ask you how you actually dove into this topic yourself. Did you yourself also have health issues that led to this, or where was the interest in metabolic health in terms of how you went into it?
Yeah. It was a bit of an evolution where I was finishing my undergraduate degree, and my undergraduate degree was exercise science, which is pretty common. And even my interest in it was pretty common. It was because I had always been physically active and was interested in how the body adapts to exercise. So in that sense, it was a perfect major for me at the time. But as I was nearing the end of it and faced with the stark reality of someday needing to have a job, I was more appreciative of the fact that exercise science, like many, many college degrees, does not really prepare you for a singular job. That's one of my critiques of academia, and I'm a professor, so I contribute to academia. It is that a lot of majors or a lot of degrees don't actually help someone get a job. And so one of my rallying cries with my own kids is study something that's practical and has a job connected to the degree. But I was faced with that stark reality. I wondered, what do I want to do? And I had a moment, and I thought about this a great deal. I was really taking that seriously, because in part, I knew that I would have a family, I'd be married with kids, and I knew that my role, I hoped, would be the traditional father-husband role, that I would be the main breadwinner for the family. And I thought, I want to have a job that will allow me to provide for my family, but also have the flexibility to spend time with them. And I was impressed by my professors that these were men and women who seemed to really have a good work-life balance. And that was sort of the precipitating moment for me, where I thought, I kind of want to look into becoming a professor. And so I was able to talk with some professors, get a wonderful amount of insight and perspective and direction. And then it became a matter of studying the literature and becoming more and more interested in obesity. And then ultimately my interest in obesity and shifting from muscle cells to fat cells, it then spilled into how does obesity contribute to type 2 diabetes? And and the connection there is insulin resistance, for mechanisms that we can discuss to varying depths. But basically, as the fat cells grow, it begins to promote insulin resistance, and insulin resistance is the foundation of type 2 diabetes. So that was the evolution. But I couldn't have known at the time, when I was first directing my career to study insulin resistance, I really thought that insulin resistance was only relevant to human health in the context of type 2 diabetes. It was a matter of time for me to appreciate that it was also foundational to things like Alzheimer's disease and various forms of infertility and heart disease and fatty liver disease and more and more and more. And that's when I really began. It was that awareness that helped me, that forced me to ask the question, how can I start sharing this outside of the ivory tower of academia? Another critique of academia that I have is that too much of the ideas are ideas just for the sake of the idea. And it's scientists and professors up in the ivory tower thinking they're so clever, when in the real world, those ideas have no value. And I thought, if these are ideas that I believe have value, then I need to do more than just publish peer-reviewed manuscripts. I need to have a way to bring these ideas into the real world and just see whether they do have value. And my conviction that they do has only grown over the last 10 or so years.
You know, I love the fact that you said that. The way I almost see it was, you know, I was originally trained as an interventional radiologist, which was a super subspecialized specialty that uses imaging to perform minimally invasive surgeries. And certainly in the medical community, or the traditional medical community, there was a cause of there was a disease cause, and then, you know, we work out drugs or some ways to fix it. And since sort of, you know, healing myself and stepped away from traditional medicine, I started to almost become a huge generalist. And the way I almost kind of look at metabolic syndrome is, it is a symptom that is associated with all these other, you know, all these other conditions, that when your body's physiology is off, so is your metabolism, so is the functioning of other systems that are off, that ends up being, if it's your neurological system, then yes, it's Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia. If it's your cardiovascular system, then it's atherosclerosis and heart disease, so on and so forth. It's just, when you've got a system that's awry, then it's, you know, basically it leads to other systems being off, which is why I find insulin resistance metabolic syndrome being such a cornerstone association for so many disease processes. So in your mind, what has been the major contributors to insulin resistance in the metabolic syndrome? And just to define metabolic syndrome for people who might not have the clinical definition, why don't you start with that?
Yeah, right. That's a good place to start. So very foundational. So metabolic syndrome is a constellation of problems that on the surface are unrelated, but of course intimately connected. It's important to note then, in the process of defining this, that metabolic syndrome, this constellation of dyslipidemia, expanded waist circumference, hypertension, and high blood glucose or hyperglycemia, this constellation, this cluster of conditions, used to be referred to as the insulin resistance syndrome, when it was first identified that these things always happen to go hand in hand. And so then briefly, I think it is incumbent upon us to define insulin resistance very briefly. And insulin resistance is a coin with two sides, of course, like every coin has. On one side of the coin, we have the phenomenon that begets the name insulin resistance. Specifically, some cells of the body aren't responding to the hormone insulin as well as they used to. Now, I was very specific in emphasizing that it is some cells of the body. And even to be more specific, it's some processes within some cell, no cell is ever universally 100% insulin resistant. It's a process that happens as the biochemical pathways bifurcate. And that's a concept that's sometimes overlooked. So again, the first part of it is insulin isn't doing its job completely. That's the insulin resistance part. But that becomes a particular problem in light of flipping the coin over, which is the other part, hyperinsulinemia, or the chronically elevated insulin. That's fine or even beneficial for the cells that don't respond as well to insulin as they used to. But there are some cells that are as insulin sensitive as they ever were. Now they have too much of a signal from insulin and they're doing too much. The contribution of all of this is, of course, highly pathogenic, and that is insulin resistance as we define it. And then the key, as you then started the question, what are the key contributors? There are a lot of noxious stimuli that will light the fuse to insulin resistance. I lump them mentally into two baskets. The secondary causes, which is a basket we'll just put on the shelf for now, because the quality of evidence just doesn't totally support them as fully independent variables. And let's talk about just the three primary causes. Primary, by my definition, means they have been validated as each independent causes in all three commonly used biomedical models: isolated cell cultures, laboratory rodents, and humans. Those three causes are stress, specifically elevated cortisol and/or elevated adrenaline. Anything that pushes those hormones up will directly cause insulin resistance. The next one is inflammation. Anything that increases the expression or the circulation of pro-inflammatory molecules, these cytokines, will cause insulin resistance. And then lastly, the big one, the elephant in the room, is hyperinsulinemia itself. And then the astute among the audience can see how I'm describing a bit of a vicious cycle. That is the most important one, because in my mind, it is the one that is the biggest contributor, because the average diet, well, I was going to say American diet, but the fact is this is a global issue nowadays, is to basically eat refined starches and sugars every 2 hours or so. And so the body is constantly in a hyperinsulinemic state. So too much insulin causes insulin resistance, forcing the pancreas to release more insulin, which feeds more insulin resistance. I focus the most on that one because I do firmly believe it is the biggest contributor of the three, but also it's the one that you can do the most about. If we were speaking to an individual and we would say, hey, your cortisol levels are high and that's contributing to your insulin resistance, and they may say, well, how can I lower my cortisol? We would say, well, it's not really clear what's causing it. You know, stress is a very ambiguous, difficult thing to get a handle on. So too is inflammation. Inflammation is a real contributor, but let's say the person has an autoimmune disease that is very, very difficult to manage. We know that as an autoimmune disease is active, so too is the insulin resistance. And so that's a difficult one to really grasp. Hyperinsulinemia, in contrast, we can get a firm grip on, and we can measure it very, very well, although it's often not. It's so often overlooked as a metabolic marker. And we can start to change it by just by managing macronutrients and the frequency of the consumption. So manage your macros and frequently fast. It's such an easy intervention, but I realize I'm getting a little ahead of myself.
Let's start with that. I mean, let's give people sort of the tools. I mean, first off, when you're looking at insulin, we know that, you know, the traditional docs and the functional docs have a different sort of threshold, you know, in terms of what they like fasting insulin to be, or what insulin looks like after a meal. One, do you sort of look at insulin throughout the day? Does fasting insulin count more than an insulin after a meal? How are you looking at insulin, and what number should people sort of try to target in terms of the ranges?
Yeah, so these are great questions. The best way to determine insulin resistance is through a dynamic insulin test. In other words, like an oral glucose tolerance test, go in and drink the syrup and then measure insulin every 30 minutes for at least 2 hours. That is the best. And the simplest way of looking at that is asking, where is the peak? And if the peak is at 30 minutes and every subsequent time point is coming down from that peak, That's a very, very good sign that the insulin is doing its job and the body's responding well and the body's insulin sensitive. However, it's difficult to do a dynamic insulin test. It's expensive, it takes time. So the fasting insulin test is a nice option. And my recommendation is that if a fasting insulin is less than 6 microunits per mil, that's a very, very good sign. Now, however, like most hormones, insulin has a rhythm to it. And it's entirely possible that we have an individual who's very insulin sensitive and their insulin comes back at 11 or 12. And we just caught them at the peak. But in reality, if we'd caught them an hour later, their insulin would be 2 or 3, which is very, very good. And so that's why it's helpful to add some of the other surrogate markers, specifically the triglyceride to HDL ratio. The triglyceride to HDL ratio is easy to do because we always measure blood lipids. We will always get triglycerides as a number. We will always get HDL. And if that ratio, it kind of depends on ethnicity. Different ethnicities naturally have different levels of blood lipids. So for Black populations, that ratio should be around 1, or 1 or below, and that's a good sign. For Caucasians and Asians, it should be around 1.5 or below. That's a good sign of insulin sensitivity. And then for Hispanics and a handful of other ethnicities, I'm just kind of touching on the major ones in the US, that would be around 2. A triglyceride to HDL ratio of around 2 or less is a good sign of insulin sensitivity.
Oh, so many questions to ask, and I hope people don't mind me geeking out here. Now, going back to the dynamic insulin range, where you mentioned a peak of insulin after a glucose challenge should go up at 30 minutes and then come down. What would be the abnormalities of insulin resistance? Would you see the peak, go on for quite some time then?
Yep. So it's not uncommon, in fact, more common than not, that the peak would be at 60 minutes or 90 minutes. And overall, that invariably, that is always connected with an ultimately greater area under the curve. Although I didn't introduce that idea, but just the total time in which insulin is elevated is significantly greater. But yeah, the peak, if the peak happens at any point after 30 minutes, that's a very strong sign that the person is insulin resistant. Now that's a test called the Hiyashi test, which I think is the simplest and still very effective indicator of insulin resistance with the dynamic test. There is a longer test called the Kraft test, K-R-A-F-T. It is a little better. It is longer and it is more complicated to interpret the curves. And so I don't typically invoke that one, even though I'm happy for people to be aware of it and learn it more. But that Hiyashi test, where look at the 30-minute point, to me is one of the clearest, simplest, and very precise tests.
Oh, you know what? I am going to geek out because I know many people, are looking at their tests and they kind of want to know what to do. So I'm certainly going to geek out. Before I geek out on other markers, let's go to the triglycerides and the HDL a little bit. Would the interventions that you mentioned in terms of the fasting and probably reducing, the carbohydrate intake, would those two interventions seem to work for all three of those markers there?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, resounding yes, resounding. And we've published on this and are doing, by nature of a collaboration with a clinic, we've been accumulating a remarkable and wonderful amount of data. So resounding yes, those will all get better very, very quickly. One of the ironies of blood lipids, particularly triglycerides, is that dietary fat improves triglycerides.
Yes, I've noticed that.
And it's carbohydrates and the spike of insulin that will stimulate the creation of new triglycerides, enriching the triglycerides within the so-called triglyceride-rich lipoproteins like VLDL and LDL, which are the main triglyceride carriers in the bloodstream. So insulin, this is just further reflection of insulin's chokehold over all things metabolism. Insulin controls metabolism to such a powerful degree that it will powerfully influence the levels of lipids within the blood. So yes, the good news of all of this is that if someone's listening to this and they're thinking, I probably have insulin resistance, I'm a little overweight, and I have hypertension. In fact, if someone has high blood pressure and they're a little overweight, done. You have insulin resistance. we can look at these markers and it will confirm it. But I'm not saying we don't need them. It's helpful. But
Yeah.
you within a week, within days, those numbers start to improve and improve dramatically, to the point that if we have had individuals on type 2 diabetics on multiple medications, and within days they have to start having their physician removing the medications from them, of course, always with physician approval and physician oversight, but they need to begin changing their antihypertensive medications and their anti-hyperglycemic medications within days, because the metabolic improvements, or I should say the metabolism, is so responsive to these lifestyle interventions.
Let's talk about how somebody might start then. So
Yeah.
let's talk about maybe the fasting. Is this something where you're promoting maybe daily time restricted feeding with occasional longer fasts, or what would be your approach for somebody?
Yeah, my approach to fasting is a little indifferent, but not because I'm apathetic, but there are just so many ways to do it. And I would rather that someone be mindful of all the opportunities and find and progress or evolve through them. Because if I were to say 24-hour fast, do it and do it right now, for someone who's never done that, it's not going to go very well. And I also speak about fasting with a certain degree of reverence, because it is something that is potentially abused. Like I know a lot of people fall into this trap where it becomes an eating disorder of binging and purging, not in a kind of bulimic state where they're vomiting, but they will fast, trying to do a 24-hour or 48-hour fast, and they just break, they get hungry and binge, and they feel shame, they feel horrible, and they resolve to do better tomorrow, only to do the same thing again and again. Yeah. So much more important than how long someone fasts is how you end the fast. So regardless of the time, make sure you have a very firm plan in mind with how you're going to break the fast when it ends. Now, having said all that, I think a nice sort of introduction to fasting is a simple 4-4-12 or mini fasts. Eat a breakfast, don't eat anything until lunch, 4 hours. Eat lunch, don't eat anything until dinner, at least 4 hours. And then after you eat dinner, don't eat anything until breakfast the next day. A lot of people will find that very difficult to do because they're so used to eating every 2 hours. So start with a 4-4-12 mini fasts, and then cut out one of the meals at the ends of the day, the bookend meals. Either fast through a breakfast or fast through a dinner. If you actually compare the two, fasting through dinner is better. It does yield better metabolic benefits, but it's also really awkward. I'm a family guy. I can tell
socially
myself,
very difficult to do.
It just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. I don't want to be sitting around the dinner table looking at my family and talking while they're all eating and I'm just staring at them. It's just too weird. So I personally will very, very commonly fast through breakfast. I'm not hungry. A lot of people aren't. They eat breakfast because they've been told that
they've been conditioned to. Yep.
They've been conditioned, but many people don't. So I would say it's easy to go through breakfast, have some coffee or tea, unsweetened, or just drink water. And then when lunch comes, have a nice big lunch. But when the time comes to eat, manage your macros. And the 3 macronutrients, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, all have varying effects on insulin. Whereas fat has no effect on insulin, protein has a very modest effect. Carbohydrates, depending on the carbohydrate, can have a substantial effect. But of course, not all carbs are created equal. And so my mantras, my rules for these is to control carbohydrates, prioritize protein, and don't fear fat. So with control carbs, focus on fruits and vegetables, whole fruits, whole vegetables, eat them as much as you'd like. They're perfectly fine. The insulin impact is very modest. Generally, tropical fruits have a higher effect, like bananas, mangoes, that has a bigger effect.
Pineapples,
Pineapples, But generally, if it's whole fruits and vegetables, you're fine. The second, prioritize protein. Make sure you're getting good, high quality protein daily or frequently, depending on your fasting. In general, animal proteins are a superior source of protein than plant proteins. But if the plant protein is fermented, then I can give it 2 thumbs up. If it's not a fermented protein, and generally it's not going to be quite as bioavailable, may not have all the amino acids, but if it's like a fermented soybean, like a tofu, or nowadays there are more and more options for fermented proteins, that will be a better source. Then lastly, don't fear fat. We were designed to eat fat. It is essential in the human diet. Don't fear it. Buck the trend of the past 50 or 60 years and give up the low fat, zero fat foods. Fats are natural. We should eat them. We should enjoy them. Animal fats and fruit fats are good. In my estimation, based on the evidence that I'm familiar with, and I'm familiar with a lot, animal fats and fruit fats. And the fruit fats are fats that oils that come from pressing the flesh of the fruit. So coconuts, olives, avocados, those are it. But be very careful with the seed oils or the so-called vegetable oils. We call them vegetable oils, but there's nothing vegetable about them. Soybean, canola, cottonseed, rapeseed, all those seed oils, avoid them as studiously as you can.
Yeah, those are very, very inflammatory.
Yep.
Wow, you just broke that down very simply, and certainly I want to make sure people have those resources, coming for them. Have you ever found any supplements or anything other than those things that you just discussed? There was basically a nutrient program as well as a time restricted or how you eat. Have you found any supplements or anything else to change those three markers: HDL, triglycerides, and insulin resistance?
This episode of the Thrive State podcast is brought to you by the Thrive State Accelerator. The Thrive State Accelerator is actually a home course that I developed using the exact same techniques I work with my celebrity clients, CEOs, and executives on how to get them to the Thrive State. The Thrive State Accelerator teaches you how to master your 7 bioenergetic elements. That's sleep, nutrition, movement, stress and emotional mastery, relationships, our thoughts and mindset, as well as purpose. In this Thrive State Accelerator, you're also going to get a bonus module on optimization. That's how I talk about supplementation, peptides, all the optimization techniques I use with my clients to get them to the Thrive State. Now, for some of you who are just joining us for the first time, you guys might be wondering, what is the Thrive State? Well, the Thrive State is actually the energy, the epigenetic environment we give to ourselves, telling our DNA how to act and how to respond. And if we want optimal health, longevity, and peak performance, if we can master these 7 bioenergetic elements, our ability to have those 3 things that we just said, optimal health, longevity, and peak performance, is at its greatest. And it also prevents you from getting chronic symptoms like brain fog, being overweight, feeling sluggish, acne, pain, all these chronic symptoms, as well as preventing you from getting chronic disease. So getting to that Thrive State is really getting to that state to master being that very best version of yourself so you could show up for you, for your family, for your business, everything that's important to you. So go ahead, check it out right now at kienvuu.com/accelerator and use coupon code podcast25 for 25% off. Now back to the podcast.
So there are some supplements that are very well supported. And my thoughts on supplements is, I look at supplements very favorably. I think they absolutely have a role, but if someone is trying to use supplements to compensate for messing all their macros up, it won't really work. You're just sort of wasting your time and money. But if someone's managing their macros, but they still want a little push, then supplements, I think, can be very helpful. And this can be things as crazy as apple cider vinegar, which is a very effective supplement at not only inducing satiety and helping with hunger, but also improving glucose levels quite dramatically, to be frank. Also things like inositol or berberine, natural supplements, cinnamon, turmeric. These are all things that have been shown to improve insulin resistance as well. But again, it will not make up for having bad macronutrients. You have to have your macros aligned and solid, and then these are things that you can add on top to just really accelerate your improvements.
Excellent. Now, before we dive in a little bit deeper in terms of the signs and symptoms, were there any other laboratory values you find important? You know, some people look at proinsulin or some of these other more finer type of lab values, or do you find basically looking at the dynamic insulin as well as the HDL and triglyceride ratio to be paramount?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I actually, I think that's kind of the trifecta, the trinity, the holy trinity of metabolic markers. And I would feel no need to add to it. Depending on the context, it may be helpful to measure C-peptide, which is actually part of, so Kien, you mentioned the proinsulin. That is that's sort of a twin sister molecule of insulin, C-peptide is, where for every one molecule of insulin you make a C-peptide. Now, C-peptide has a much longer half-life than insulin does. And so you can't compare their levels in the blood. But if someone is on insulin therapy, like if someone listening to this is a type 2 diabetic and they're on insulin, then measuring insulin doesn't work. Because if you were to take their blood and do an insulin test, who knows how much of the insulin you're measuring is coming from the syringe? You don't know how much the person is actually making. C-peptide is proof or is evidence that the beta cells are still there. They're producing insulin. And this is someone who can start to adapt to these dietary interventions very, very well. And if they're on insulin therapy, with their physician's oversight, start to dose the insulin down to the point of getting off it entirely.
Great. Let's dive a little bit into the symptoms. You know, like you and I, Ben, could probably look at somebody and then have an idea. We're not judging them or anything like that, but they're insulin resistant. So many people, you know, have asked me, how can you tell? It's just, you know, when you have a certain amount of fat that's showing in your body, usually the labs are, you know, are very confirmatory for that. So what are some more unexpected signs of insulin resistance that people should be aware of? I mean, you know, back in medical school, one of these things that people mention is like, oh, okay, yeah, you know, if you have diabetes, you're going to go to the restroom all the time. I don't know if that's super specific for that, or people should use that. But what are some of the things that people might overlook to be signs of insulin resistance?
Yeah. So let's actually start with body weight, just because it's so compelling. As much as we focus on obesity and fat mass, or the total mass of fat that someone has on their body, what's actually more important than fat mass is the size of the individual fat cells. And this becomes particularly compelling when we look across the ethnicities. So I did my fellowship work, my research fellowship in diabetes in Singapore, this beautiful Southeast Asian country. I'm sure everyone's heard of it by now. It was amazing, and we loved living there, and it's been a favorite, almost a second home for my family ever since. One of the reasons I went to Singapore is that the government in Singapore created a collaborative medical school with a heavy focus on research with Duke University from the US. Their interest in diabetes was because of the incredible prevalence of type 2 diabetes among the Asian and South Asian populations within Singapore in particular. But the more I learned about this, being there and studying diabetes, the more struck I was by how different these people look. And I mean metabolically speaking. I could have an Asian man of Chinese, kind of typical Chinese Asian of descent, Singaporean, and then I could have a Caucasian Northern European Singaporean. You know, they're both citizens of this beautiful country, two totally different backgrounds, ethnically speaking. And the Chinese Singaporean, he would only be moderately overweight, and he would have profound type 2 diabetes, profound hypertension. And the obese Caucasian would have modest insulin resistance and maybe slightly higher hypertension. So it led me to this conclusion. I joke a little bit about it, but if you really want to be fat, you want to be Caucasian. Caucasians appear to be the ethnicity that can handle the fat mass a little better. And it's because this is an ethnicity that has the potential to make new fat cells more easily. And the paradox of fat mass is that if you have a body that can produce more fat cells, it can paradoxically get more fat, but because each individual fat cell is smaller, it's a healthy fat cell. And so much of metabolic mayhem starts in the fat cell. Small fat cells are healthy, insulin-sensitive fat cells. So the person would be potentially 500 pounds, and yet they don't have diabetes. On the other hand, I could take one of my Chinese Singaporean friends. He's just gained 20 pounds, and now all of a sudden he's profoundly type 2 diabetic because his genetics don't allow him to make new fat cells. And this is how most people are. As much as I'm comparing these two ethnicities as if there's a massive difference between them, the fact is, while a Caucasian can get fatter than an Asian, especially Chinese Asian ethnicity, it's often not as dramatic as I'm making it sound to be. Most people across all ethnicities have a finite number of fat cells. And so as they continue to get fatter, each fat cell is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and more insulin sensitive and more pro-inflammatory. So this is my long-winded way of just saying, as much as we focus on fat mass, it can be a little tricky because some people who are obese may not have insulin resistance at all. And some people who are only modestly overweight may have profound insulin resistance. So to answer the question specifically, with all that being a very long preamble, one of the more unexpected markers of insulin resistance is the skin, where the skin is in a way a window to peer into the metabolic health of an individual. And there are two things to look for, particularly around the neck, but also around the armpits or even the groin, wherever skin starts to fold and rub. And the two things to look for, they are separate, but often come together. One is these skin tags, which are these teeny little stalks of skin. Yeah, I bet everyone already knows what I'm talking about. It's these little teeny, and they are small, but it's like a little column of skin, almost looks like a teeny little mushroom. It's not a big round mound of skin, a teeny little bump. So those are skin tags that will happen around the neck or the armpits. But often going along with that is a condition called acanthosis nigricans, which is when the skin starts to get a little more darker pigmented and also a little kind of tissue paper crinkly. Like you take tissue paper and crinkle it up and open it back up. And that's how the skin would feel. Now, I emphasize the touch of it because someone's natural pigment may kind of hide the darker pigmentation. I'm so pasty white that you'd see it on me pretty easily. But if I had one of my African Black friends here, you wouldn't see the pigment change on him very well. But the skin tags would be evident on both of us. So maybe one of the least expected, but also one of the easiest, because you just look at it, markers would be looking at the skin.
Now, is that secondary to hyperinsulinemia?
It is.
And its sensitivity specifically to the skin cell?
Yeah, it is. It is a consequence of the hyperinsulinemia, which is inducing this sort of accelerated aberrant growth of the keratin of the skin and aberrant activity of the melanocytes. So it's very much a consequence of the hyperinsulinemia side of the coin of insulin resistance.
Okay. Would somebody that has skin tags, could anyone have skin tags but not have insulin resistance or hyperinsulinemia?
Yeah, so probably. I have to speculate. Probably, certainly it's possible, but I would say very unlikely. That if someone has it, it's generally a sign that you need to start making some changes. The good news is that they change as insulin resistance gets better. We know we're always losing skin. Skin is growing and shedding and growing and shedding, and the skin tags and the acanthosis nigricans can resolve as well quite rapidly.
Wow. Okay. Any other unexpected signs people should be looking for?
No, that's the best one. I'll leave it at that.
All right. That's really good. Many people don't realize that that's the case, and always thought that was something genetic. It is potentially passed on, but probably what's passed on is the lifestyle of your parents that's getting passed on.
Yeah. So I do think that would be the case, to be honest. If someone is noticing a familial pattern to it, it's probably not the skin problem. It's the metabolic problem. And there's certainly a genetic or a familial pattern to being insulin resistant, but also the environment just happens to always go along with the genetics.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned some really key things, and I'm pretty sure that these are the same type of things that people can do to manage and reverse prediabetes, because those are exactly the things I did to reverse my own diabetes, to improve brain function, to lose weight, and to prevent diabetes altogether, which really watch your macros and fast. Do you have anything else you'd like to throw into that list?
Yeah, so that is absolutely the 800-pound gorilla. If people aren't doing that, anything else is going to have modest benefits. But assuming they're doing that and they even want more, of course, exercise is tremendously valuable. Any form of movement, the nature of the dynamic contraction of muscles, the muscle gets so hungry as it's working that it doesn't need to wait for insulin to tell it to start pulling in glucose. It has a back door that, so if someone's very insulin resistant, then just starting to engage in any kind of physical activity, especially of the big muscles of the legs and getting up and walking, the muscle becomes hungry and it just starts pulling in the glucose. And as the glucose comes down, the insulin comes down too, making the body more insulin sensitive. And then also, that's an expected answer. And so maybe I'll go with some unexpected ones, at least one, and that would be sauna or cold therapy.
Let's talk about those. Yes.
Yeah, either of those has been shown to have profound metabolic benefits in improving insulin sensitivity, even though they're absolute opposites. So in the case of cold therapy or cold immersion, there are two benefits to it, metabolically speaking, in addition to just the mental benefits, which are very real. And one is that the shivering muscle is almost like an exercising muscle. As the muscle is spasming or contracting to create heat, it's hungry, it's working out. And so just like I described with exercise, the same thing's happening to the shivering muscle. And all of that is in an effort to warm the body up. So the shivering muscle is part of the benefit to cold therapy, but also fat cell metabolic rate goes up significantly. As much as we look at fat tissue as just being a tissue built to store fat, when the metabolic milieu is right, it becomes a tissue that wants to burn energy rather than just store it. And metabolic rate of even white fat, the white fat is the fat that we have that is right beneath our skin. That fat has a very, very low metabolic rate, but with cold therapy, it goes up by multiples. And that's not an insignificant amount, because even on a generally healthy body weight person, fat mass contributes to about 8 to 12% of their total metabolic rate. So it's a very meaningful amount of the total energy expenditure. So you increase metabolic rate of fat tissue, which just further helps lower glucose, which helps improve insulin. And then on the other side, it's sauna therapy, which has been shown to be a very good therapy for people, especially people who can't exercise. This, I think it's kind of safe to say this is a pretty good backup, or in addition, if you can do both, because you so significantly accelerate blood flow through the body that it helps just dilate vessels and feed all the tissues more, which helps lower glucose. But you also are getting a bit of a cardiovascular workout. You start panting, you're breathing a little heavier, your heart's beating harder, all in an effort to try to cool you off. So sauna, sweating in the sauna, or shivering in the ice bath are both very, very good additions to all of this, creating a pretty whole approach to improving insulin resistance.
Let's talk a little bit of the practicalities. How would you prescribe people doing that? Maybe a couple minutes a day in the cold, or maybe at least 20 minutes in the sauna. What temperatures do you like? Can you give people like a general idea as to what is sort of like, a minimum viable time? Like if you just dip your toe to cold water for a second, does that help?
Yeah, I wish it would, because it's never pleasant. So with cold therapy, I can't get too specific. I'm just not familiar enough with, what is the ideal temperature. But the best is full immersion up to the neck, where the clavicles can get covered as well. That makes a significant difference. And the hands can be left out. Sometimes it can become quite painful if the hands are in, depending on how cold it is. But if you can just go to 5 or so minutes of shivering type cold, that's really, really great. But many people will not have that opportunity, and they don't even care to. But if they still want some of the benefit, get a bowl of ice cold water, and a bowl that is big enough that you can immerse your face in, and actually put your face in and blow some bubbles if you need to for just as long as you comfortably can, and do that a few times. The face has a remarkable number of temperature sensitive receptors, and that can ignite the same metabolic processes, albeit to a much more modest degree, that you can get when you're doing a full-on immersion. And then with regards to the sauna, if someone can be in the sauna long enough to start sweating, actually like sweat dripping down from them, and stay in there for another 5 to 10 minutes, that's great.
Awesome. Do you know much of the science behind cold shock and heat shock proteins and their downstream effects on metabolic health and other health parameters?
Yeah, so I'm familiar with heat shock proteins, particularly in the context of mitochondrial biogenesis. So one of the benefits of this family of proteins that is temperature sensitive, the heat shock proteins in particular, is that they do stimulate PGC1 alpha, which is a master regulator of all kind of overall metabolic processes, but particularly of mitochondrial biogenesis, where it will stimulate the body to begin producing more mitochondria. So that happens very actively. And cold shock, I don't know as much about that.
Okay, well, this has been super enlightening. And in fact, this is probably the best masterclass I've had in metabolic health, which is so succinct and simple, and it gives people, very simple takeaways that people have. Now, you've already mentioned this earlier, but we know that stress really is the driver of insulin resistance as well. Do you sort of have favorite stress reduction techniques that you like to implement throughout the day?
Yeah, I sure do. Yeah. So as much as I focused on hyperinsulinemia, I don't want someone to conclude that I don't think the other two matter. They do enormously. But again, it's difficult to really get a firm grasp on them. I believe the best way to get a firm grasp on stress is sleep. And I'll be a little unconventional, because everyone already knows, stop looking at screens 2 hours or so, ideally 3 before you go to bed. Fewer people know of the value of getting sunlight exposure as early as possible in the day, looking up to the sun or up to the sky, not the sun directly, of course, but the value of sun exposure early in the morning to start setting the stopwatch for the day to help you sleep better that night. So I will mention an unconventional one, which is don't go to bed with a hyperglycemic state. We know that when the body is hyperglycemic, it activates the sympathetic nervous system. So you will go to bed with a higher than normal body temperature, making you uncomfortably warm. We know that hyperglycemia does stimulate body temperature, and you will go to bed with a heart that is beating harder and faster than it otherwise would. You are literally activating your fight or flight response at the worst possible time, when it's time to rest and digest. When you go to bed, you want the parasympathetic, the opposite nervous system, to predominate. But if you are going to bed after you have eaten a bunch of starchy, sugary junk in the evening, you will sleep worse. And then that poor sleep will result in a stress response the next day, which it does. And it's demonstrated very well, which will also further have a demonstrable insulin resistance impact. So, but the tragedy is, of course, it's the evening when we are at our worst. For me personally, I can be walking by a bowl. I could be walking by a bowl of frosted mini wheats all day, and it won't tempt me at all. I can look at it with utter indifference until the kids are in bed and the house is clean at 8 p.m. or 8:30, and it's time for me to settle down and relax. Now, all of a sudden, there wouldn't be enough frosted mini wheats in the world to satisfy me. And it's in the evening where we begin craving something that is salty and crunchy or sweet and gooey, often both in sequence. And that's the worst possible time for it. Now, I'm not encouraging an indulgence at any other point in the day. I'm just noting the particular tragedy of biology, where most people are the most tempted in the evening, when it is literally the worst time to be indulging in it, because you will go to bed hyperglycemic, you will sleep terribly, and you will wake up and have a rougher metabolic day, and in every possible way, probably only to repeat it again and again. So the best way to control your stress is to ensure good sleep, because sleep deprivation is very stressful, literally. And the best way I believe, to get good sleep, in addition to all of the knowns, is to not eat. And once 4 hours or so before you go to bed, do everything you can to stop eating. Get things out of the house if they're tempting. Like, we don't have cereal in my home. It's a funny for me to point out that example. It's not by chance. It's because I'm an absolute addict. If we have cereal in the home, I will rip the house apart to get it. As much as I know, it just goes to show the difference between knowledge and implementation, and addiction. The nature of addiction, that is, an addict is someone who knows what they're about to do isn't good for them, and they do it anyway. And if I have cereal in the house, I can't control myself. And so I, as the father, have made mechanisms to prevent that from happening. For my own sake and for the sake of my kids, I make breakfast every morning. It's always a home-cooked breakfast. The kids are eating. In part, I want them to have a home-cooked breakfast. I want that time with them in the family dynamic. And my job allows it, thankfully. And I know not all people have that option, but it also is a mechanism to prevent dad from becoming morbidly obese and diabetic from eating all the cereal we bring into the house every night.
Wow. Now we know your kryptonite. Now I know
absolutely.
if I ever need you to be anywhere in the evening, just to drop a trail of cereal.
I will follow it like Hansel and Gretel. And even though I know I'm going to be baked in the oven at the end of it, I would still follow it because I'm an addict.
So just quickly, do you think it's just a matter of the maybe stress levels kind of building up that makes us crave it? Is it our changes in microbiome around that time? Why are people so much, why is the craving, a bump up? Is there a scientific
I wish I knew.
I'm
sure there is. And I should know, but I don't know. I'm sure there's some explanation.
This has been such a beautiful conversation. Like I said, this is like masterclass level conversation here, so I really appreciate it. How do people find out more about your work and what you offer for people out there?
Yeah, thanks again. This has been a lot of fun. So I crystallized a lot of these thoughts into a book, and people can find my book, Why We Get Sick, generally anywhere books are sold, certainly online. And it's basically a lot of what we spoke about, admittedly with much more detail. What is insulin resistance? Why does it matter? Where does it come from and what to do about it? But also more evidence of me wanting to put these ideas into practice. I'm a founding partner with a company called Health Code, HLTH Code, and people can learn more about that at gethealthlth.com, where we have created a low-carb meal replacement shake and just providing a lot of educational material in the form of an ebook, ebooks, and blog posts that people can consume as freely as they'd like.
That's been beautiful. I'm very interested for this very last question that I'm going to ask you today. You've been exposed to so much different therapies that are out there. What has been your best medicine?
Yeah, what a great question. My best medicine for my entire being, physical, mental, and spiritual, I think has been to follow the advice that my dad gave me when I was leaving the home. And I suspect by the time I left the home, he had perfected this, because it was a very compelling comment where he said to me, and he was a very good example of this, which is, of course, the essence of parenting, modeling the behavior you want your kids to adopt. And he said, Ben, take your duties seriously, but not yourself. And I have been struck by just how wise and profound that statement is. And it has been something that has really helped me form my identity as a person, as a husband and a father, and as a professor in how I teach, that I acknowledge that there are certain things I need to do. And it's important that I take them seriously because they're my duties, they're my responsibilities. But at the same time, I am a human being who is riddled with flaws. And so too is every other person I'm going to interact with. And so when I make mistakes, or when they make mistakes, laugh about them rather than laughing at them, or pointing them out in a kind of mocking or condescending way. My ability to, I believe, born from this sage advice I received, but my ability to not take myself seriously not only helps me enjoy life more, it has helped me take criticism much better than I would otherwise have taken it,
Mm.
because I don't take myself seriously enough to refuse to believe that I don't have flaws. Now, that doesn't mean I'm a clown. That's not, I don't want people to think that we're all going around with the big red nose, squeaking it with big clown shoes. No, by not taking yourself too seriously, what I mean to imply is what I stated earlier, which is embrace the flaws of life and let them become moments of levity rather than moments of, severe austerity and consequence. That it's okay, if it's possible, in the midst of the flaw, to find humor in it and to invite someone to laugh with you about the moment, rather than turn it into a stern reprimand. As a dad, that's something I've very much tried, to varying levels of success, to really embrace. And if my kids make a mistake, ask myself in that moment, do I need to reprimand them for this? Was it an accident? If it was an accident, then there's no need to reprimand. And then I can just say, oh my gosh, make it into a joke. Make it into a moment of tenderness and affection rather than condemnation and scolding. Sometimes that's appropriate. I don't mean to suggest it isn't, but anyway, again, to put it succinctly, take your duties seriously, but not yourself. Be humble.
So beautiful.
Yeah, be humble. Be receptive to criticism and improvement.
As a father myself, I appreciate the comments, and what a great nugget and piece of wisdom for everybody listening. Dr. Ben Bikman, thank you for being on the Thrive State podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of the Thrive State podcast. And if this podcast is bringing a lot of value to you, if you find that your life is just improving with this podcast, that your life is getting to the next level, please consider supporting it. And here's a few ways you can do so. You can do so by liking this video and commenting on this video, and also sharing this video with your friends and family. Another thing you can do is go to ratethispodcast.com/ThriveState. Go ahead and leave us a 5-star review there. It will really, really help this show grow. And this will give me more time so that I could actually give more content to you, just like you got in this episode. And if you haven't already picked up a copy of my book, Thrive State, Your Blueprint for Optimal Health, Longevity, and Peak Performance, you can pick it up now. It became a #1 new release in longevity. Go to thrivestatebook.com. And if you enjoy the book, please consider leaving us a review as well. And the last thing you can do, if you're liking everything here and you want to work more closely with me as well as my team to get you into the Thrive State, go to kienvuu.com/accelerator and consider joining the home course, the Thrive State Accelerator. It's really the course that I use. It's the concepts that I use personally when I work with CEOs, celebrities, and my high-profile clients to get them to the Thrive State. Again, the Thrive State Accelerator at kienvuu.com/accelerator. And because you're a listener of this podcast, I want you to save 25% by using the coupon code podcast25. I hope we continue to give value to you. And remember always, you are your best medicine.